Kaidu did maintain the rule of the House of Chagatai in the center of Asia, so that his people were known thereafter as the Chagatai Turks. His successors reverted to the earlier clan life of raid and pillage. Being too weak to venture elsewhere, they raided their own cities like Samarkand and Kashgar. Kaidu's death, however, had one unexpected consequence in the outer world. He had been the last member of the family to try to carry out the dream of world conquest. With Kaidu in his grave, the feud between the House of Ogadai and the House of Tului died out. The Mongol Khans no longer struggled for the now visionary central power, and this in turn brought about a truce. Between the years 1301 and 1339 of the Common Era, the civil wars in the Mongol-governed dominions died down to scattered forays. The nomad peace again prevailed in Asia and Eastern Europe. The caravan routes were still open. Mongol tolerance still made existence easy for the followers of various religions, and that meant for all the populations. This world truce was the Indian summer of the Mongol rule. Ghazan perhaps inspired it more than any other man. He demanded it when a distant cousin, Nogai, who wandered between the Crimea and the Balkans with his Byzantine princess and slaves, invited Ghazan to unite with him and to drive the powerful Golden Horde northward. Ghazan refused. Nogai offered to share the Volga region between them. After driving out the house of Juchi, Ghazan still refused, as he should if the idea is just to rule different lands. The law of Genghis Khan, he reminded the aged Nogai, forbids war within the Mongol nation. If Ghazan had launched himself into this civil war, it might have had a decisive effect on the future of Russia, because it would have broken the Mongol yoke upon that captive people. As it happened, the veteran Nogai was defeated by the Golden Horde in the steppes and slain. Nogai was the last leader of what might be called the war element among the 14th century Mongols. Ghazan, wiser than he, had clearly seen that the future of the Mongols lay in the caravan trade and an economy of peace. After their defeat, Nogai's sons and followers withdrew to the steppes around Crimea. There, they kept to the ancestral way of living and allowed, for the time being, Venetian and Genoese merchants to use their ports. They became known as the Nogai, or Cream Tatars. They ruled over that strange peninsula, the refuge of exiles for some 4 centuries. The truce prevailing from 1301 to 1339 proved a happy circumstance for Europe rather than for the Mongol Khans. By this time, after the return of Marco Polo, the Papal Council realized the tremendous significance of the East. Groups of missionaries were sent across Asia. In fact, this interval is called the time of the missions. The Westerners were looking toward the East with open eyes. Also, the merchants had the freedom of the East for nearly 2 generations. The trade in spices, paper, pearls, and fine textiles grew larger. In 1325, we find one Savignano of Genoa commuting back and forth between China and the Crimea as both envoy and merchant. Goods out of Ceylon were shuttled through the Persian Gulf. Ships reached Java and Sumatra that had been Kublai's objectives. A certain Messer Francesco Piccolotti, acting for the great house of Bardi in Florence and for Edward of England, wrote out his practice for merchants in the years 1335 to 1343. You will travel a safe road, he testified, from Tana, the port for slaves near the Crimea, to Cathay, even at night. Such is the evidence of merchants who have used it. The truce, however, did not last. Before Messer Francesco had finished writing his advice to Eastern salesmen, the caravan routes became not so safe. The clans of the Chagatai Turks were becoming zealous Muslim in mid-Asia. In 1339, they eradicated the Christian settlement at al-Malik. Perhaps this was the first religious persecution in any Mongol-dominated lands. And, of course, it has nothing to do with Islam. Islam does not allow the persecution of other faiths. Then, when the descendants of Kublai were driven out of China in 1370, the Christian religion was proscribed and foreigners exiled. Well, that's persecution, but why? Al-Malgik, why did they fight those people? What did those people do? That's the real question. Mongol built transcontinental roads began to fall into ruins, and the Chagatai clans began to drift away from these trade routes. They had to retreat from the once fertile valleys. During the long civil wars, most of the men were kept in the saddle. The cultivation and irrigation of the dry valleys fell to the women and unfit men who could not cope with the labor, so the clans, which still kept together, withdrew by degrees to the hills where natural grazing could be found and water in the streams coming down from the snow areas. With this withdrawal and the decline of the great caravan traffic, the cities of Central Asia sank into stagnation. Desiccation went on unchecked, and at the Gobi's edge, towns were invaded by the encroaching sands, particularly in the area of the 5 cities where the rivers were drying up in their beds. Elsewhere, caravan cities, half deserted, began to yield to ruins. This wasting heart of Asia became known as Turkestan, the land of the Turks, and a voyager could write of it. Hardly anything is to be seen now in Turkestan but ruins more or less complete. From far off, as you approach, you see a settlement that looks well built, surrounded by fertile fields, but near at hand you see that the houses are empty and the ground overgrown with grass. You do not find any people because they are nomads who live elsewhere and do not practice agriculture. It was out of such a Turkestan, with its ghost cities and memories, that Tamerlane emerged. He was a pure Turk, an adventurer, an individual soldier. By his attack in the middle of the 14th century, he shattered the remnants of the Mongol-controlled trade routes and the hierarchy that had held Asia in fee for a century. Tamerlane, the individual soldier, 1336 to 1405 of the Common Era, the scion of the Barlas clan of Turks, the Iron Limper. Timur-Lang dreamed of the conquest of Asia. Not being a descendant of the house of Genghis Khan, he could claim no hereditary right to dominion. Instead, he placed upon various thrones, from Delhi to Angora, puppet figures, the distant grandsons of the Mongol conqueror. He took for himself only the surname of Amir al-Badr, the Great Lord. Well, Prince of the Command, really. He aspired to military conquest, and perhaps no man in the record of history, unless be the spectacular Alexander of Macedon, achieved so much of his ambition in his lifetime. He was, in almost every respect, the Napoleon of Asia. Insignificant and body, limping from a wound after his early years, he drove himself to achievement by irresistible willpower. Like Napoleon, he assembled his first army from bands of disorganized men surrounded by stronger enemies. The Turkish clans of that day had not lost the military instincts of the Mongol era. Tamerlane had Napoleon's personal magnetism. He could influence masses, and his versatility was equal to any problem. He had, beside Napoleon's memory for detail and rare ability to take advantage of opportunities, like Napoleon, he organized a striking force that proved to be irresistible. Perhaps Tamerlane, when his campaigns are studied and understood, will be recognized as the most brilliant leader of cavalry known to history. His career was one spectacular chevauchade, an uninterrupted ride to victory after the struggles of his first years with the Chagatai Turks, a ride of terror leaving behind it pyramids of skulls that were milestones of his victories. No force and no natural obstacles could check his course. He was fortunate in that he lived while the Asiatic horsemen were still the most formidable striking force of warfare. He had the secret of victory, for he marched without preconceived plan, his host of wild horsemen, little drilled like Napoleon. He kept his army of perhaps 100,000 soldiers in constant readiness to maneuver. Timur Ilong usually formed his veteran Tatar cavalry on the right wing. It had its own advance and reserves. Timur's most gifted emirs commanded it. It made a formidable striking force, answering to the shock battalions of today. The Tatar strategist was apt to hold his left wing refused and to make his attack with the powerful right in a sweeping movement like the Mongol Tolugma, the standard sweep. When his right had broken through the opposing line, he would then allow the left to advance. He himself commanded strong reserves in the rear of the center, which was intended to hold fast to the ground. In this way, it acted as a pivot for two wings. It was seldom in motion until the end of a battle. After the smashing impact of his splendid cavalry, Timur was capable of swinging his whole front on the pivot of his reserves to advance obliquely after the right wing, the left following the center. The formation of his army was a permanent one, each regiment knowing its position and duties. At least once in his terrible defeat of the Ottoman Turks in Angora, Timur disappeared from the sight of the enemy with his entire command to reappear far behind the enemy's lines in possession of his camp and supplies. The Turkish army had become disorganized, first in trying to get in touch with Timur's forces, then in marching back to its own base where he awaited it. Timur availed himself of one expedient of Genghis Khan's. His divisions attacked in much closer formation than the customary loose alignment of the time. So in actual conduct, he threw the weight of two men against one, and such divisions were more easily handled. His secret, perhaps, was that he kept his forces in motion while he waited to profit by an enemy's mistake. He relied on his own ability and at his own chosen time. He was able to throw his stronger units against the weakness of an adversary. So Napoleon seems to have done. Tamerlane's victories, like Napoleon's, were the achievements of his genius. As Napoleon enriched Paris with the souvenirs of his victories in other lands, Tamerlane rebuilt Samarkand from the spoils of India and Persia until his magnificence became a legend in Europe. There, the similarity ceases, for Napoleon ended his career in St. Helena, dazed by fatigue, endeavoring to write out a vindication of his wars. Tamerlane was never defeated, and he died on the march toward China before he reached the outpost of the Ming beyond the Gobi. But the conquest of the Emir al-Qadar endured no longer than those of l'Empereur. Both were military enterprises dependent on the genius of one man. When Tamerlane had subjected the Chagatai Khans and overridden the remnants of the Il Khans, he found the Golden Horde in his way. Apparently this Pio Sabrur of Samarkand desired simply to destroy the Golden Horde as a feat of arms. With his veteran Tatar regiments, he marched north into the steppes to hunt the horde in its own lair, a feat no one else had cared to attempt. It was a march in the grand army style. In all the splendor of their silks and gold inlaid armor, his emirs crossed the hunger steppe, holding parade every evening when the sun was red over the high grass, riding past Tamerlane's pavilion with cloaks tossing, spurring their horses, while the massive Kurun trumpets blared. The Golden Horde had vanished into the north like a hunted wolf. The Tatars of Samarkand searched for traces of it, knowing that in this wilderness, the horde was never so dangerous as when retreating. It was really very much like Napoleon's advance on Moscow with his grand army. Half starving, the Tatars had to ride down wild game for food. They found the first trace of the elusive Mongols at a river where the ashes of a half-dozen fires still smoldered on the far bank, not even shadows of men. The half non-Abrahamic religion horde, I guess that's what they mean, and the Tatar cavalry met as wolves clash, both sides attacking. The Khan of the horde had waited until he was certain that hunger and hardship would not decimate the Tatars. Then he had turned at bay. Tamerlane's mastery of maneuver was too much for the riders of the horde, and they broke in headlong retreat, losing heavily as they fled. Tamerlane kept on to Sarai along the Volga. He found there the citadel of the descendants of Berkai, made pleasant by water channels running along terraces, turning huge water wheels, courtyards of tiled walls and mosaic floors, carpeted gardens, ceramic furnaces. Great shops of garment workers and jewelers had given the Khans the luxury they required, even to a new drink which became later known as coffee, something that when the early Muslim encounter it, they consider it haram. Same thing with other plants that had the caffeine, although they probably didn't know what exact chemical it was, right? But basically, they knew it was an intoxicant. They knew it diminished energy overall. They knew it diminished attention span and ability to stay still in the prayers, and gave a rush feeling, but not in the sugar or other food sort of way. So that they knew it was calmer by definition. But, profit convinced people otherwise. But PROFIT doesn't change what a religion is in terms of PROPET. Tamerlane's troopers tore down and fired both the old Sarai and the new, leaving only skeleton ruins. The twin Sarais, the metropolis of the merchants and desert khans, were never rebuilt. Only recently have their ruins been explored, riding off with their haul of slaves and loot. Tamerlane's horsemen had one of their savage celebrations after victory. This place on the Volga, his chronicler relates, had been the residence of Juchi, a son of Genghis Khan. And here Tamerlane had the satisfaction of mounting to sit on their throne. The most beautiful of the captive women of the Sarais were led before him and his lords, who set their cup in hand. The garments were stripped from the women and their hair let down. So this is a serious offense against these people are committing. All the army shared in this festivity, which helped the soldiers forget the hardships of the war. For 26 days, they amused themselves as fate permitted them. Well, just because it was predestined doesn't mean it's not their fault. Tamerlane passed on with his regiments, a strange operation in the steppes, an invisible soldier without a purpose, but in his sweep through the Ukraine, he scattered the Mongol encampments to most of the points of the compass. The Lord of Samarkand saw nothing in the bare steppes to appeal to him. He did not return, nor did the remnants of the Golden Horde gather again at Sarai. Instead, the steppe dwellers collected around Kazan in the north and down at the Volga mouths, where Astrakhan was building by the sturgeon fisheries along the caravan track that had been a portion of the road of the frontiersmen, and the Nogai Tatars remained unharmed in the Crimea. Tamerlane's spectacular career had little in common with the methodical advance of Genghis Khan from the steppes. The iron limper welcomed battle for its own sake. The cautious Mongol avoided risk. Looking ahead to the ultimate gang, Tamerlane was much too civilized to desire a change in the city civilization that lay in his path. Ostensibly a Muslim, he cared too little for religion to arouse the fanaticism of the Islamites, although his conquest enriched his soldiery with loot, and he had no plan of government to offer them. Now, see, notice how he's talking. Oh, it's if you force people to be Christian, that's not religious persecution. If you drive out, but fighting Christian people, that has to be Christian. It's like, well, didn't we read earlier that these people basically they fought amongst themselves largely, but they basically wanted to fight and conquer any land that wasn't Christian, even bold enough to say stuff to the Mongols and stir up problems that way. But Islam bans fanaticism. There's no worship of the temple or the object or the prophets, and there's none of this. Tamerlane, you can say, is far more of a fanatic because, okay, he attained the title Muslim, but how much of the principle did he have? And that's his crimes in war could be said as a feature of his fanaticism because he, kept the title, but in its, But if he stirred them up in terms of, let's defend the land, or, wars of conquest aren't defending the land. Wars of getting slaves or forcing converts or treasure or something like this is, the religious people weren't going to go for that one. Because Islam forbids it. Shia or Sunni, it's still the same thing. But I'll get back to what I'm reading here. And the multitudes of Asia are intolerant of those who cannot protect them. The steppe dwellers who came under Tamerlane's sway reverted to their natural life. The cultivators of the soil returned to their quest for food. Tamerlane was able to bequeath Samarkand to his children, and under Ulugbeg, a grandson who was himself a skilled astronomer, a revival of culture took place during the period now called after Timur the Timurid. And so, see, if had he been religious, maybe he might have helped things culturally more. His magical career, however, had two vital consequences: his humiliating defeat of the Ottoman Uthmani Turks within their hills did not postpone their advance into Europe and Constantinople for more than a half century, but his march past the Black Sea destroyed the trading centers of the Venetians and Genoese, especially at Tana. He took those worthy slave merchants and sold them as slaves. This blow to their overland traffic helped to turn the two merchant republics toward the sea at the end of the 14th century to seek new markets. In this march, Tamerlane's host passed almost within sight of Moscow without destroying the enterprising city. The Russian communities suffered little damage. Tamerlane gave them new hope by breaking the yoke of the Golden Horde. He did this for his own interest and gained nothing tangible by it, but he prepared the way for the emancipation of Russia. And the Muslim armies, whether people are Christian or not, or Muslim or whatever, they're supposed to fight for that. But if you look at Muslim majorities have killed about, Saudi Arabia is responsible for most of those deaths, right? Muslim majorities have killed what? It was 13 million before the current Yemen, the more recent Saudi-Yemenis conflict. Let's just say 15 million people had died as a result of Muslim majorities. But how much of it was Islam? Certainly Christian majorities have done over 200 million after, aside from what you could say is, the Crusader Inquisition sort of 25 million, where people were killed for not being Christian or not supposedly not being the right type of Christian, a type of killing that continues today. But how many of these Muslim majority killings were like that? Certainly none allowed by Islam, and certainly a minority. We see Tamerlane, was conquering for land and stuff, but Babar the Adventurer, 1400 and 83 to 1530. Not as yet, however, were the Russians able to break their chains. The Khans of the Cream of Kazan and Astrakhan still dominated the captive people. A century passed, and the power of the three Khanates still endured. But in the hills above Samarkand, a man was making himself felt. He was Babar the Tiger, who counted both Genghis Khan and Tamerlane in his ancestry, a poor relation of the still celebrated Chagatai Khans, an adventurer by force of circumstances who relished both melons and poetry. He had a gift for saving his life by running away and then winning battles. Taking his roost in the Afghan hills, he led his tribal following down into the plains of India. There, rather to his own surprise, he became the first of the great Moguls, or Mongols, of India. Babar felt himself homesick for the melons and the cold winds of Samarkand, but he had in him a Mongol's ability to persevere, and to rule. My family, he admitted, has always adhered to the law of Genghis Khan. This conquest and long domination by the Chagatai Turkish strain intensified the hold of Islam and of the descendants of steppe dwellers on the north of India, leaving a line of cleavage between the Muslim and the Hindu India. Hindus, not really one religion or something, but the religions among their race, right? But the Muslim were entrenched there at the time. They've been there since this 600s, I think. A line of cleavage so wide that it remains today the great problem of India. And while foreign powers trying to convince them to fight each other, that's the real problem. Imago Mundi. To understand what happened now, it is necessary to look once more at Messer Marco, his father and his uncle, after their return to Venice in 1295, unrecognized and at first suspected after the long absence of 20 years. Messer Marco found himself with his stock of jewels again a merchant in a Christian world. He did not find the change a happy one. He had been the envoy of the great Khan with messages to the Pope and to the King of England. Now his fellow Venetians listened incredulously to his tales of Cathay, the voyage of his ocean-going junk, the Princess Cochin. All it seemed to them to be the stuff of minstrels' tales. In truth, Messer Marco had been away from home too long. When he tried to adapt himself to life in Venice, he found himself embroiled with women and burdened by taxes. He was drafted into a war. It seemed that the distinguished Signory of Venice was then at war with the hated Genoese. Marco Polo was not only liable for war taxes, but he was pressed to serve, or he volunteered in the Adriatic fleet. In this service, the Venetians being disastrously defeated by the Genoese Admiral Doria at Curzola, Messer Marco found himself a prisoner in the internment camp at Genoa, which was nothing less than a dungeon. Here he was persuaded by the Genoese, who scented a prophet in it to dictate his story of Cathay and Kublai Khan, or he may have been urged by a fellow prisoner, one Rusticiano, or Rusticiano, or of Pisa, to do so. At all events, he did dictate the story of those eventful years, and Rusticiano, who seems to have been a romantic space writer of the day, addicted to the style of Round Table legendary, added a good many flourishes of his own, being careful to whet the appetite of the public with such a preamble as this: great princes, emperors and kings, dukes and marquises, counts, knights and burgesses, and people of varying degree who desire to gain knowledge of all the many races of mankind and of the sundry regions of the earth. Ye shall find herein all kinds of wonders and diverse histories, such as that of Persia and the land of the Tartars, and of Ind and many other countries, which our book doth speak According to the description given by Messer Marco Polo, a wise and most knowing citizen of Venice, as he saw them with his own eyes, and the good Rusticiano ended with this flourish. For, as was said in the beginning of this book, there never was a man, be he Christian or Saracen or Tartar or heathen, who ever traveled over so much of the world as did that noble and illustrious citizen of the city of Venice, Messer Marco, the son of Messer Niccolo Polo. In spite of such an excellent appeal, both to the curiosity and patriotism of the Venetians, the Polo Opus did not find belief. He had been too long in Asia, and the book was not the stuff that a traveler's dreams are made on, for he had failed to see the tree of life and the ramparts of Gog and Magog. But he knew them firsthand rather than by rumors and fables, really. He had, well, not everything was a fable, but he had almost no anecdotes to relate of the marvelous Prester John of Asia, who dwelt in a palace built on golden sands, and he explained the old man of the mountain as a real personage instead of the magician that popular fancy insisted he must be. In fact, because Messer Marco told the truth, he was not believed. Not, that is, by the mass of people, not despite the fact that he had brought back a Tatar servant who, it seems, was not willing to leave his master because he insisted, perhaps too heedlessly, upon the enormous statistics of the empire of Kublai Khan. His fellow citizens christened him Millions Marco when he went out of his door at the Ca Polo, or Cha Polo, or something. Don't know how to pronounce some of these things for certain. In the little square by the canal, he was besieged by beggars demanding silver coins from his millions. On his deathbed, a worthy priest urged him to recant the fables he had told and to confess that he lied. Then, for the first time in the record of his life, Messer Marco spoke a word for himself. He said that he had not lied, and more, he added, I have told but half of the whole truth. By his will, he left 100 lira and freedom from bondage to his Tartar servant Peter, and thereafter, in the Venetian puppet shows, he appeared in a mockery, a comic fellow named Il Leone. There was adequate cause for disbelief in the narrative of the conscientious Venetian. As late as 1300, the Common Era, Western Europe looked upon the outer world with the eyes of superstition from biblical